So when Nicodemus first talks to Jesus, he says to him, he says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." It's very significant that he calls Jesus Rabbi here. This is a way of recognizing Jesus as a legitimate religious leader. And then he says, "We know," which suggests that Nicodemus is one of many other religious leaders who are watching Jesus. It could be that Nicodemus saw Jesus to see if he could answer most of his heartfelt questions. But it could also be that he was there on behalf of other leaders. Maybe he wanted to find out more about what Jesus was teaching and see how that would affect their overall belief system as Pharisees. He also makes reference here to signs that Jesus performed, which means that by now, word had spread throughout the region about the miracles that Jesus Christ had performed. The scandal, though, begins in verse 3 here. Jesus responds to Nicodemus by making a statement that turns his world upside down. This is a game changer. "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." This statement drives a complete wedge into the heart of Nicodemus, his Pharisaic system of belief. You see, Pharisees believed that obedience to the law, through that alone, you could create and maintain a relationship with God. Jesus doesn't dispense with any formalities here at all, though. He cuts right to the chase. He tells Nicodemus, what you believe is wrong. You cannot even see the kingdom of God unless you first have something done to you. Nothing that you do will allow you to see the kingdom of God. And what is it that must be done to you? Well, he says this. He says, you must be born again. Now, at this point, Nicodemus could very easily have just been like, this is crazy, blasphemy. I'm not going to listen to any more of this guy's nonsense. And he could have just walked away. He would have been perfectly justified had he done that. But he didn't. He asks Jesus more questions. This suggests that he wants to learn from Rabbi Jesus. It also suggests that deep down, Nicodemus knows that he does not know what he's really looking for. If he wants to help others on their spiritual quests, he needs first to get some answers himself. Most of you know that I'm a big Star Wars nerd, so I'll use an obvious example from Episode 4, one of my favorite scenes. It involves Han Solo in the Star Wars movies. It's the movie A New Hope. We're first introduced to Han Solo, and he doesn't believe in the Force at all. He makes that very clear. In fact, he mocks people who believe in the Force. And yet, he watches and listens to the people who do believe in the Force. And just before the battle against the first Death Star, at the end of that movie, his parting words to Luke Skywalker are, "Luke, may the Force be with you." I think this suggests something. This suggests that Han Solo, this scoundrel and smuggler who doesn't care about anything but himself, has started to question his own worldview. And he started to consider the ways of the Force that he's heard about. Now, a little later, he ends up putting his life and future in jeopardy as he flies in to rescue the day and save Luke. But in so doing, Luke is able to destroy the Death Star, the rebellion is saved, and the universe is one step closer to peace. All because Han Solo wasn't afraid to seek out some answers and reconsider what he believed. And I think that's exactly what's happening to Nicodemus here. He's questioning his own worldview. What if my obedience to the law will not save me? What if I need to find my hope and my identity somewhere else? We've probably all been there at one point in our lives. But all the stuff about being born again, that gets really confusing. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it seems like it confuses Nicodemus a little bit. He says, how can a person experience physical birth twice? The reason for this confusion is linguistic, and we don't necessarily catch it in our English translations unless we know what the original Greek said here. Jesus, in responding to Nicodemus, says in Greek, you must be born anothen, which has several possible meanings in Greek. The word is anothen. It can mean again, which is how it's usually translated, but it can also mean from above. And oftentimes in ancient literature, words that had multiple meanings were used not to be ambiguous, but in order to convey multiple concepts and multiple ideas at the same time. And I believe that this is one of those instances. Jesus had all of the meanings of the word anothen in mind when he said you must be born anothen. He did mean to say that a person needed to experience a new birth. But what he was emphasizing by choosing this word is you need to experience a new spiritual birth, literally a birth from above, a birth from God. And he clarifies this in verses 5 through 8, but it's a very scandalous clarification for Nicodemus to hear. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." It's scandalous first because he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you." In effect, he is speaking prophetically on behalf of God. And Nicodemus would have understood this. And the reference to water here would resonate quite deeply with anyone that had knowledge of Jesus just turning water into wine. And Nicodemus had probably heard about this recent miracle. The water that Jesus has in view here is what's known as Jewish mikvah water, which is living water. It's purification water. This is the water that, according to Jewish law, could make a person pure and clean in the eyes of God. And Jesus, by turning water into wine, was further establishing himself as the ultimate personification of these living, purifying waters. You have to understand, this would have been totally, completely scandalous for any Jewish person to hear, whether they were a Pharisee or not. Essentially, what Jesus is saying here is the old system, the old way of doing things, has passed away. Jesus could be saying to Nicodemus at this time, basically, God is doing things differently now, and he's doing it through me. Just imagine how scandalous that would be. And there's reference here to the Spirit, which further emphasizes the spiritual nature of being born again, which becomes even more clear by the time we get to verse 6. He says, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." Again, this kind of statement would have challenged Nicodemus' beliefs to the very core. You have to remember, as a Pharisee, he believed that obedience to the law gained favor with God. If we want to be right with God, you have to obey God's law. If we want spiritual birth or renewal, you need to obey God's law. Jesus is turning the system completely on its head. He's saying, no, that's not true. Your righteousness will not get you into the kingdom of God. The only way you can get into the kingdom of God is if you're born from above by the Spirit of God. It's completely scandalous. Completely. And then, as if Jesus anticipates that Nicodemus will be blown away by this concept, he says this, "Do not marvel that I say to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." These words would have had a huge and challenging impact on Nicodemus, but they're probably equally challenging for all of us to hear today. By making this connection to the Spirit and to the wind, Jesus is teaching that the Spirit, just like the wind, can blow wherever it chooses. It's not something that we can manipulate or twist. Pertaining to being born from above, we don't have the ability to force the Spirit's hand and say, okay, I'm ready to be born now, or I'm not ready to be born now, let's just wait a little bit. The Spirit is the one who determines the process. The Spirit determines the time, and the Spirit determines who it will give birth to. Now, I'll be honest, as I reflected upon this and thought about preaching on this, it made me a little bit uncomfortable. It's a challenging concept. It seems like it's very clear in the Scriptures, but at the same time, it's hard to accept, especially as Americans. I mean, we love to elevate the role that our choices can play in our lives, but what if there's some choices that are made by forces that are outside of ourselves, forces beyond our control, especially spiritual forces? That's just not something we're really comfortable hearing. Now, as uncomfortable as that makes us, imagine how much more uncomfortable and challenging this would be for someone like Nicodemus, whose entire life and livelihood was based around making the right choices. And he taught others that they needed to make the right choices. And yet, as Nicodemus interacts with Jesus here, he's hearing something completely different. Why would Nicodemus continue to listen to these kinds of teachings? I mean, the only explanation I can think of is that God's Spirit had to be working on Nicodemus' heart as he was standing there in the presence of Jesus. Look at the song Under the Milky Way again. The last verse, I think, is very haunting, but at the same time, it's hopeful. And I think it speaks well of Nicodemus at this point. It says this, "And it's something quite peculiar, something shimmering in white. It leads you here, despite your destination, under the Milky Way tonight." Could it be that something peculiar, something shimmering and white, led Nicodemus to be with Jesus at this point. Perhaps this song gives us a poetic description of what someone like Nicodemus saw in Jesus, something shimmering and white. This is the kind of language that Nicodemus would have been very familiar with. It's the language that the Ancient of Days, or that the Old Testament uses to describe Jesus. The Ancient of Days, the Son of Man. It's found mostly in the book of Daniel. It's symbolic language that's used to describe this great messianic figure who would usher in the kingdom of God here on earth. Perhaps Nicodemus was drawn to Jesus because deep down he knew that Jesus might be that very Messiah that his scriptures foretold. In verse 13, in fact, Jesus implies that he is this Son of Man that was spoken of by David. And if that's true, then perhaps his words about being born from above are also true. Perhaps the very reason that Nicodemus was being drawn to Jesus was because the Spirit of God was drawing him to Jesus and was testifying that everything he was saying was true. So why would this need to be the case? Why would the Spirit have to draw someone like Nicodemus to Jesus? And why all the scandal associated with that happening? I keep emphasizing this, but it's very important. The Pharisees believed you could gain God's favor by obeying the law. And in order to make sure that you obeyed the law, they built this fence around the table of the law. In other words, they created even more laws that you needed to follow in order to make sure that you didn't accidentally disobey any of the law of God. The problem with this system is that it makes the law too heavy of a burden for anyone to carry. No one can do it. No one can perfectly obey it. There's a creative way that I've thrown around here before in terms of remembering what a Pharisee is all about, what Pharisee means, right? The Pharisees' view of the law wasn't very fair, you see? Because no one could do it. Pharisee. Pharisee. You can take that one with you. Remember that one. Nobody could live up to their standards. Listen to these words from the Psalms. This is Psalm 14 and 53. They were written by King David, who knew a few things about man's inability to fully obey the law. He said this, "The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They've all turned aside. Together they all become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one." Now these aren't terribly flattering words. But before you think that David is judging everybody, he's not just saying these things about everyone else in the world. He's saying this about himself. He recognizes that as much as he loved the law of God, he couldn't obey it perfectly. Nobody can. That's why the Spirit of God is so essential. If no one will seek after God, the only way that someone will seek God is if God first seeks them. This must have torn Nicodemus up inside. He was a man who believed he was seeking after God with all his heart by following these rules and regulations. And he taught other people the same thing. But deep down, he knew this was a hollow pursuit. He knew he could never fully obey the law. He knew that he needed something more. He just didn't know what it was that he was looking for until he encountered Jesus under the Milky Way.